BC Rail operates in one of the most spectacular natural environments on this continent. This videotape will show you 24 hours of BC Rail action in and around one of railroading's natural wonders, the Fraser River Canyon. BC Rail was originally known as the Pacific Great Eastern. In 1972, the name was changed to British Columbia Railway to better represent the railway's owner, the province of British Columbia. This railway, now known as BC Rail, is very much a child of the 1950s and 1960s, reaching Vancouver and the Peace River country only about 40 years ago. This view of the tracks along Howe Sound shows why it took until 1956 for the Pacific Great Eastern to build this section of track between Squamish and Vancouver. You are going to see 24 hours of BC Rail action on both sides of Lillooet. The Fraser River is the only natural gateway to Vancouver from the east or northeast. At the time of the building of the Pacific Great Eastern, both sides of the lower Fraser River Canyon were already taken by the predecessors of the Canadian National and Canadian Pacific, who followed the Fraser to its junction with the Thompson River. To reach central British Columbia and the northern reaches of the Fraser River, the PGE had little choice but to take a difficult and treacherous route from Squamish over two mountain ranges and along two incredibly treacherous lakes to reach the upper Fraser River at Lillooet. We will see 24 hours of BC Rail action between the top of the Coast Range at Alta Lake and the Fraser River Canyon north of Lillooet. This shows the grade profile for BC Rail from the top of the climb out of the Fraser River Canyon at Kelly Lake to Vancouver. This section of track contains all of the significant grades on BC Rail. Northbounds have a 2.2% grade following the Cheakamus River to the summit of the Coast Range at Alta Lake, and a 2% grade up a divide between the Lillooet River and Anderson Lake at Birken. The most difficult grade for northbounds is the 27 miles of 2.2% climbing out of the Fraser River Canyon north of Lillooet. Fortunately, northbounds are mostly empties and do not normally use the manned pushers based out of Lillooet. The normally very heavy southbounds have 2.2% grades climbing up to the Birken and Alta Lake summits. Southbounds usually attack these grades with one or two slave units and a manned pusher set. The first two trains that we will see will be along the Cheakamus River on the grade to Alta Lake on Wednesday, May 25, 1994. High railers, or motor cars known as speeders, lead all trains along the sections of track most prone to rock or mudslides. Near Garibaldi, alongside the Cheakamus River, a high railer precedes number 2, the southbound passenger train. A daily passenger train utilizing recently rebuilt RDCs is operated between Vancouver and Lillooet and 3 times a week beyond Lillooet to Prince George. Here at 6:50 p.m. is southbound number 2 near Garibaldi. A northbound was in the siding at Garibaldi, and we quickly caught up to him as he was still climbing up the 2.2% grade to the top of the Coast Range at Alta Lake. This is train VO, which stands for Vancouver to Omineca. The Omineca Plateau is the name for the area around Fort St. James, north of Prince George. Prince George is 462 rail miles north of Vancouver and is the largest city in the interior of British Columbia. In addition to train VO, when business is at a high level, BC Rail runs two other northbound freights, which are symboled VP for Vancouver Peas and VC for Vancouver Caribou. The Peace River is the mighty river which lies 150 miles north of Prince George and flows north to the Arctic Ocean. The Peace is the gateway to much of northern British Columbia. The Caribou Country is what most of the area around Quesnel and Prince George is called, and Lillooet lies at milepost 1 of the Caribou Highway. All three of these trains run all the way to Prince George, no matter what their name implies. Train VP and its southbound counterpart, PV, run all the way to Chetwynd, which is the next crew change point north of Prince George. Symbols for southbound freights are the same letters as northbound's, but reversed. Almost all the cars in this train are empties, so only 2 units are needed to hoist it up to 2.2% grade. Siding switches are still hand-thrown, so BC Rail uses cabooses on all their freights. Mon Siding lies just north of the summit at Alta Lake. At 8 p.m., southbound train OV for Omineca to Vancouver rolls along Daisy Lake, a mile north of the siding at Mons, where he will meet train VO. Train OV has 79 loads, 3 empties, and nearly 9,000 tons behind power positioned at 3 places in the train to enable him to get up to 2.2% grades of Birken Hill and the climb to Alta Lake that he has just completed. Northbound train VO is headed into Mons Siding just ahead. There, this train will cut out a set of 4 SD40 manned pushers, which are placed 25 cars back from the head end. Most of the older boxcars in the head end of this train are filled with wood pulp or fiber bound for the port of Vancouver to be exported to Asia. Next comes boxes and center beam flat cars of lumber bound for the United States. The Pacific Northwest complains loudly about Canadian lumber exported to the U.S., but lumber bound for the U.S. through Vancouver is down at this time compared to previous visits in 1987 and 1990. Wood chips exported to Asia through the ports of Squamish and Vancouver are also down at this time. This means that on most days of the week, BC Rail is running only 2 freights in each direction between Prince George and Vancouver, rather than the usual 3. BC Rail has what at first glance seems to be a surprising amount of piggyback business between Vancouver and the interior of British Columbia, considering how few people live there. This amount of trailer and flat car business is surprising only until you see how roundabout and difficult the highways are that run from Vancouver to Prince George. Note the triple platform flats and different types of trailers, from flatbeds hauling lumber to refrigerated trailers that carried groceries to the interior British Columbia on their northbound trip. BC Rail uses remote control of slave units on most of their southbounds, and there was a C40-8M call unit, or -8-40cm if you prefer, from General Electric, 49 cars deep in this train. No more southbounds were due. We took the Duffy Lake Road to Lillooet. At 3 minutes to midnight, southbound PV enters Lillooet Yard. Lillooet is 157 difficult and sometimes treacherous rail miles northeast of Vancouver. The Duffy Lake Road from Pemberton to here, now known as Route number 99, has recently been blacktopped and guardrails have been added, making it a much easier way to get to Lillooet. The town and rail yard are on a shelf about 200 feet above the mighty Fraser River. 45 miles downstream lies the Canadian National and Canadian Pacific at Lytton, which is at the junction of the Thompson and Fraser Rivers. 2 miles north of here, the BC Rail tracks cross the Fraser on a high bridge and then climb out of the canyon on one spectacular piece of railroad. South of here, the tracks run alongside Seton and Anderson Lakes, where rock slides have claimed a number of lives and locomotives over the years. Lillooet is shielded by the Coast Range from winter storms and gets little snow or precipitation of any kind. These storms give some of the best skiing conditions in the world to the Whistler and Blackcomb ski resorts that lie next to the tracks near Moran Siding where the meet took place last evening. Train PV has 76 loads, no empties, and just over 9,000 tons. The first part of this train was 31 gondolas of export sulfur from Fort Nelson, which is over 500 miles north of Prince George, and from a Petrosol refinery at Pine Sol near Chetwynd. Then comes more export fiber or wood pulp and older boxcars. 64 cars deep are 2 C40-8M slave units. After the boxes of wood pulp are boxes of fiberboard and lumber and flats of lumber bound for the U.S. Most of these cars will be turned over to the Burlington Northern at Vancouver, but the Canadian Pacific and Union Pacific will get a few of these cars bound for the States. Most of the lumber produced in British Columbia that is bound for the U.S. is produced in mills near or north of Prince George, and is turned over to the Canadian National at Prince George. The CN has a line that runs from a major seaport at Prince Rupert to Jasper that crosses BC Rail at Prince George. As many as 2 solid trainloads of lumber a day run east of Prince George on a Canadian National to markets in the U.S. via the Duluth, Winnipeg, and Pacific. Coal comes south from BC Rail's electrified coal line north of Prince George and heads west to Prince Rupert on the CN. Grain is grown on the high plains east of the Peace River. The Canadian National has a branch line through the Peace River country that connects with BC Rail at Dawson Creek, and that may be where the 3 covered hoppers of wheat on this train came from. During the night, the Lillooet switcher works the yard, making up a northbound local and switching setouts and pickups for mainline trains. Unit 602 is an Alco RS-18 rebuilt with a Caterpillar engine in 1993, accounting for its strange appearance. It is rated at 2,075 horsepower. This unit switches the yard during the night and handles a local and a unique school train that carries children from remote points to school in Lillooet during the day. At 5:20 a.m. on May 26, 1994, the next train arrives at Lillooet. This is the northbound hotshot train VP from Vancouver to the Peace River country. Lillooet is surrounded by some of the most beautiful scenery in North America. Two miles north of Lillooet, train VP crosses the Fraser and will shortly begin the 27-mile, 2.2% climb out of the Fraser River Canyon. This bridge and the town lie almost 200 feet above the snowmelt-swollen river. North of Fountain and about 5 miles into the 2.2% grade, train VP clings to the side of the canyon. Besides the C40-8M and SD40 on the head end, a second GE unit running as a remote-controlled slave is needed 64 cars deep in a train. The tracks and highway change places below Glen Fraser siding. Train VP is the hotshot on BC Rail. If any train can be called a hotshot that takes nearly 24 hours to cover 462 miles. It gets out of North Vancouver around 9 p.m. and is scheduled into Prince George 22 hours later. This train may not make great time, but the highways into the interior are not much faster. Because of the 2.2% grades, at least 7 of these hours are spent getting from the yard at North Vancouver to Lillooet. Train VP is usually the only northbound to have the slave units positioned in the middle of the train, as the other northbounds are not as heavy and carry at most a handful of loads. VP handles all the northbound piggyback traffic for ramps at Quesnel, Prince George, Fort St. John, and Dawson Creek. VP is blocked at North Vancouver so that it can quickly get out of Prince George and make a second morning delivery of the trailers to Dawson Creek and Fort St. John. Note the mix of trailers and ocean-going containers being carried on chassis in this train. Where else have you seen spools of cable riding piggyback? The flatbeds that are used to carry steel and cement forms may return south carrying lumber. Many of these trailers, including some of the BC rail trailers, are refrigerated and are carrying groceries. Safeway even runs their own trailers on these trains. The rest of this train is all empty boxes, empty lumber flats, and covered hoppers for grain. North of Glen Fraser siding, which is midway up the hill, VP enters a short tunnel. At Pavilion, VP enters a horseshoe curve where there is a large side canyon. At Moran, one can get an aerial view of train VP and its slave unit. The tracks are 1,500 feet above the Fraser, and we are 1,000 feet above the tracks. At 1:20 p.m. at Pavilion, we see a track speeder coming down the hill, a good sign. The track car stays about 2 miles in front of the train, with each calling out the milepost on the radio. The next day's train OV follows the speeder down the hill, carefully heeding the 20-mile-per-hour limit down the 2.2% grade. The presence of a C40-8M in the lead is a good sign that this will be a good-sized train with a slave unit further back, as these units contain the master and remote radio gear. The gondolas on the head end of this train were carrying sulfur. Today's OV looks quite similar to the OV seen last evening, with boxes of export fiber, lumber, and piggyback. Today's OV will be followed by PV and CV into Lillooet around midnight and early morning, respectively. This train has fewer trailers than yesterday's, since the following PV and CV will have the trailers from St. John and Dawson Creek on them. The Pacific Great Eastern predecessors to BC Rail dieselized with all Alcos. Until a few years ago, this line was ruled by C630s and M630s built by Montreal Locomotive Works. The big 6-axle Alcos used to have the radio gear for controlling slave units installed in them and usually led mainline trains. British Columbia Railway also had a small fleet of C425s, RS18s, and M420s. During the 80s, BC Rail acquired 30 new and used SD40s, but the major Alco killers were the C40-8M call units. 22 of these were received in 1990 and 4 more last year. All of the 6-axle Alcos and C425s have been sold or scrapped. The new GEs generally achieved a 3-unit for 5-unit reduction on these heavy terrains. BC Rail has been upgrading their track structure in recent years. Some welded rail can now be seen around here. The line north of Prince George to Chetwynd has been upgraded to take 6-axle units. For power on the lighter railed lines north of Prince George, BC Rail has maintained 16 4-axle M420s, half of which are cabless boosters. For locals and switching, BC Rail has 29 RS-18s, 18 of which have been recently re-engined with 2,075 horsepower prime movers from Caterpillar. One of those will be seen on a northbound local shortly. Note the flatbed trailers of lumber. With the exception of the gondolas of sulfur and TOFC, most of BC Rail's business is related to the forest products industry. At Glen Fraser Siding, halfway down the hill, OV meets a northbound local with cars for limestone loading and trailers for a work gang. Unit 602 is an RS-18 re-engined last year by Caterpillar. Five miles further down the hill, the tracks hug the side of the canyon in an incredible series of S-curves. For 23 miles between Lillooet and Moran, roads closely follow the tracks. Highway number 12 follows the tracks to Pavilion, where it then takes the side canyon to the main north-south road into the interior, Highway number 97, which rejoins the tracks at Clinton. A rough gravel road that is not for the faint-hearted leaves the highway at Pavilion, climbing above the tracks and giving us the aerial view at Moran. There are many incredible photographic opportunities along this highway north of Lillooet, and as you will shortly see along Seton Lake south of Lillooet. All of these scenes were taken at points easily accessible from the local roads and highways. This videotape barely begins to show you the many photographic wonders for a rail fan around Lillooet. With its large native Indian population and being off the beaten path, Lillooet may not be a tourist mecca, but for this rail fan, it is an incredible destination. Where else can you see a train wrapping itself around so many S-curves at once? While train OV was entering Lillooet, a northbound was only a few miles away from Lillooet, crawling along Seton Lake. This train is heavy enough, even though it was nearly all empties, to require a slave unit 64 cars back. As usual, a track car or speeder precedes the train. Around one of these curves, an engineman died and two locomotives disappeared into the lake in 1980 when a landslide occurred in the short distance between the track car and the train. The trackage along this lake is one curve after another. Seton and Anderson lakes were created by water overflowing huge landslides that were hundreds of feet deep, probably caused by earthquakes that occurred thousands of years ago. For 30 miles along Seton and Anderson lakes south of Lillooet, the speed limit is 20 miles per hour, as the tracks are in effect on the side of a canyon, yet only a few feet from the water. Roads reach both ends of these lakes, but the road to the south end of this lake is best traveled only in good weather by a four-wheeled vehicle. This train, VC, for Vancouver Caribou, does not run every day depending on the level of business. As you can see, it is a good-sized block of empty sulfur gondolas. 3 northbounds are scheduled to run from BC Rail's yard at North Vancouver to Prince George. The hotshot VP gets out of North Vancouver around 9 p.m., VC around 6 in the morning, and train VO anytime from noon to early afternoon. Except for the intermodal traffic on train VP and a few loads of chemicals for the paper companies, virtually all other cars on the northbounds are empties. Due to the grades and curves, trains take 7 to 9 hours to make the 156 miles from North Vancouver to Lillooet. Nowadays, BC Rail runs northbounds up to 130 cars long, and southbounds can weigh as much as 10,000 tons. BC Rail's stature of today was recently acquired. In the 1950s, the Pacific Great Eastern had only 1 or 2 short trains in each direction through here. As the extensions were built north of Prince George in the 1950s and 1960s, and new lumber mills began to ship lumber to the States in quantity in the late 1960s, traffic multiplied on BC Rail. Remote-controlled slave units were added in the mid-70s, allowing BCR to raise the train size that could be handled on the 2.2% grades to around 8,000 tons. Recently, BC Rail has reopened their Dease Lake extension northwest of Prince George that may someday go to Alaska. Of course, the best way to see this trackage along Seton and Anderson Lakes is to ride the passenger train, which runs daily as far as Lillooet and 3 times a week from Lillooet to Prince George. During the summer, BC Rail also runs a steam train along Spectacular House Sound between Vancouver and Squamish behind the Royal Hudson, number 2860. Back at Lillooet, the 3 RDCs that came north as train number 1 wait for the connecting RDCs from Prince George on train number 2. All of BC Rail's 10 RDCs have been recently rebuilt. As you will see, a good-sized crowd has gathered for train number 2 to Vancouver. The Lillooet station is quite new, having been built in 1986 when BC Rail rearranged their yard to hold additional long trains. At 3 p.m., Lillooet is a busy place as we get ready to head south to the lower part of the Fraser River Canyon where the Canadian National and Canadian Pacific run side by side, covered in the first part of our Fraser River Canyon series. From left to right are trains OV, VC, and number 2. I hope that you have enjoyed this all too short look at one of this continent's most fascinating railroads, BC Rail.